Sadie Monroe believed apartment 9B on the 9th floor of the Meridian was her final refuge. A silent fortress in the heart of Chicago, where she could vanish completely from the man who had destroyed her life. She had no idea that the quiet man living in 9A across the hall, with a thin scar along his jaw and dark eyes that never rested on anyone for more than a second, was the most powerful crime boss in the city. That first night, as the deadbolt slid into place with a heavy metallic thud, Sadie pressed her forehead against the cold door and took what felt like her first real breath after months of running. She once had a home, a career, a dream of wearing the white uniform her mother wore, until a man cloaked in a healer's coat, worshipped by an entire hospital, turned her every shift into a nightmare and twisted her complaint against him into a verdict that buried her instead. Now all she had left was her mother's old nurse's watch on her wrist, a name plain enough to disappear into a crowd, and the habit of checking the peephole every time the elevator chimed. But fate has its own cruel sense of irony. A dark trail of blood on the hallway carpet. One rainy night would pull the hiding nurse through the door of apartment 9A, where the line between the most dangerous man and the safest shelter was thinner than she had ever dared to imagine. If you love gripping stories that touch the heart, hit that like button and share this video with fellow story lovers. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the unexpected journey ahead. And stay with us until the very end, because that rainy night was only the beginning. The night shift in the emergency department at Northwestern Memorial Hospital began at 7 o'clock in the evening and ended only after the sun had risen. Sadie chose the night shift not because of the extra pay, but because darkness was the ally of those who were hiding. During the day, she slept behind thick curtains drawn tightly shut. At night, she slipped into her nurse's uniform and became someone else. Someone useful. Someone who didn't have to glance over her shoulder with every step she took. The emergency department was the only place where she felt truly alive. There, amid the steady beeping of heart monitors and the hurried rattle of stretchers being pushed through the corridors, her hands no longer trembled. Those hands guided a needle precisely into the vein of an 80-year-old man, performed chest compressions on a man whose heart had suddenly failed, and wrapped clean bandages around a young woman injured on her way home. Those long nights, soaked in sweat, gave her something precious that nowhere else could offer. The feeling that she still had value, but even beneath the shelter of a white lab coat, the past still found a way to cling to her like a stain that could never be washed away. One night, a coworker standing beside her accidentally brushed the back of her right hand while they were helping lift a patient, touching the exact spot where a small burn scar had faded with time, and Sadie jerked her hand away so quickly that the other person immediately apologized. She forced a smile, said she'd only been startled, then turned away before the curious gaze could linger any longer. No one there knew where that scar had come from, and she would do anything to make sure no one ever found out. No one noticed, either, that in the staff break room she always chose the chair in the corner, with her back against the wall and her face turned toward the door. It was a small habit, almost invisible, but to Sadie, it was a law of survival. People were only attacked from behind when they left their backs unprotected, and she had learned that lesson at a price greater than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. The truth was, she had never wanted to return to a large hospital. During her first several months in Chicago, she worked at a small private clinic that paid her in cash, a place where no one examined her documents too closely. But that meager salary couldn't cover the rent on her apartment at the Meridian, and when the last of her savings finally ran dry, she was forced to take the risk and submit an application to Northwestern, even though she knew every nursing record left a trace in the system, like a fragile thread that someone patient enough could follow. She tried to reassure herself that America was vast, and that using her real legal name, Sadie Monroe, was a calculated risk she had to take, as her nursing license could not be falsified at a major hospital like Northwestern. She prayed the name was ordinary enough to disappear among tens of thousands of nurses, that he would never imagine she would dare return to the very profession she had once practiced. But deep inside, she knew she was lighting a small lamp in the middle of the darkness, and all she could do was pray that the predator somewhere beyond it wouldn't see the glow. Outside the hospital, Sadie's life had narrowed into something as thin and silent as a shadow. She never accepted invitations to dinner with her coworkers, never attended a birthday gathering in the department, and always claimed she was tired or busy so she could refuse as politely as possible. At first, a few people continued inviting her. Gradually, they grew accustomed to her silence and left her alone. She had no social media accounts, posted no photographs, and left no comments on any page. The location services on her phone were always turned off, and she used it only to receive her work schedule and make calls she couldn't avoid. Every evening before leaving her apartment, she stood behind the steel door of apartment 9B, pressed her eye to the peephole, and watched the empty hallway long enough to make certain nothing seemed unusual before turning the lock and stepping outside. Every morning when she returned, she repeated the same ritual in reverse. On some nights, while standing on a windswept train platform and watching streams of strangers pass before her, Sadie wondered how long she could continue living this way, living without daring to have a friend, without daring to use her real name, without even daring to keep a single photograph as a memory. Then she answered herself by tightening her fingers around the old nurse's watch on her wrist, the last thing her mother had left behind, the only possession she had carried intact from her former life. Her mother used to tell her that nursing was the work of those who kept watch over life through the darkness, and as long as Sadie could still stand inside an emergency department, she would still have a reason to wake up. She didn't need happiness. She only needed safety. And during her first weeks at the Meridian, she almost believed she had found it. The building was as silent as a giant vault. The receptionist in the lobby guarded the entrance carefully. The elevators opened only with a key card, and the 9th floor hallway was always so empty that she had memorized the sound of her own footsteps against the carpet. She had no idea that such absolute silence wasn't an accident, that the entire floor operated according to rules she couldn't see, and that only a few steps from her door, behind the door of apartment 9A, there was a man living a double life of his own, a man who also remained awake while the whole city slept, and who was also being hunted by ghosts that belonged only to him. The first evening Sadie saw the man from apartment 9A was a night of torrential rain in the middle of October. She was just preparing to leave for her shift when she heard the elevator chime in the hallway, and following a habit that had long since settled into her blood, she pressed her eye to the peephole in the door. Through the warped fisheye glass, a tall figure stepped out of the elevator, wearing a dark overcoat, still beaded with raindrops that glittered beneath the hallway lights. He moved in a way Sadie had never seen in anyone before, neither quickly nor slowly, without a single wasted motion, as though every step had been calculated before his foot ever touched the carpet. Then, suddenly, in the middle of the hallway, the man stopped. He didn't turn his head or look toward her door. He simply stood motionless like a statue carved from granite, and Sadie felt her heart tighten inside her chest. Through an instinct she couldn't explain, she knew with absolute certainty that he was aware he was being watched. 5 seconds passed like 5 minutes. She didn't dare breathe or blink, and her hand gripped the doorknob so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then the man continued walking as though nothing had happened, slipped his key into the lock of apartment 9A, and disappeared behind the door. Sadie remained standing in the darkness of her apartment for a long while, listening to the pounding of her heartbeat inside her ears. He was only a neighbor, she told herself, only a wealthy man living alone in Chicago. The city held thousands of people like him, but over the following month, the unusual details kept quietly piling up like small stones, one after another, until they became a mountain she could no longer pretend not to see. The man in apartment 9A came home at hours when the entire city had already fallen into deep sleep. 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. Those hours matched her night shift perfectly. So again and again, Sadie crossed paths with him in the elevator or in the hallway, when she was coming home and he had just returned as well. 2 exhausted people standing together in silence beneath the bright elevator lights. He never started a conversation, never nodded in greeting, and never looked at her for more than a second. A faint scent of expensive cedarwood clung to him, sometimes mixed with the smell of black coffee, and one night, when the elevator doors closed behind him, Sadie caught the lightest trace of a sharp, burned odor that the instincts of an emergency nurse recognized immediately. The same smell she often found on the clothing of patients brought into the emergency department after shootings. She told herself she was imagining it. She wanted to believe she was imagining it. But then there was the car. Every time she went down to the parking garage, she saw the polished black SUV parked in the space nearest the elevator, its engine idling softly, like the low growl of an animal deep in its throat, its windows so dark that nothing inside could be seen. And there were the men. They stood scattered around the vehicle in carefully tailored suits, but their posture wasn't that of office workers. Their feet were planted shoulder-width apart, their arms hung loose and ready, and their eyes swept across every corner of the garage in steady, repeating patterns. Their jackets were cut with skill, but not enough skill to conceal the hard bulge at the left hip, the bulge that Sadie, who had spent 3 years beside a man who forced her to learn how to recognize every kind of danger, knew exactly how to identify. Her reason screamed at her to stay away, warning her that the man in apartment 9A was an iceberg, and that the 9 parts hidden beneath the surface were certainly nothing innocent. But there was something strange that took Sadie many weeks to admit even to herself. She wasn't afraid of him. One morning, as she stumbled home after a shift that had lasted 12 hours, her keys slipped from her numb fingers and fell onto the hallway carpet outside apartment 9B. Before she could bend down, a large hand had already picked them up. The man from apartment 9A stood there, holding the keys out to her with a calm gesture, saying nothing. His eyes passed over her face for only a moment before moving away, as though she were merely another ordinary detail in the hallway, no different from a potted plant or a wall lamp. He gave the faintest nod, then turned and walked toward his own door, leaving Sadie standing there with the keys still warm from a stranger's hand. And in that moment, a contradictory truth seeped into her like warmth passing through a cold coat. She felt safe, because throughout the 3 years of hell she had endured in Philadelphia, Preston Hale had never looked at her that way. Preston's gaze had always clung to her like a layer of grease that couldn't be washed away, measuring every expression on her face, remembering every piece of clothing she wore, every person she spoke to, and every smile she gave to anyone else. That gaze told her, "You belong to me." But this man looked at her as though she were a stranger with no connection to his life. And for a woman who had been forced to run from a gaze that never released her, that cold indifference was the most precious gift of all. Sadie had no idea that behind the door of apartment 9A, the man with those fathomless dark eyes had paused for a single beat before continuing on, and that in his world, there wasn't a single detail that went unremembered. That November night, Sadie's shift ended close to 6 o'clock in the morning, while the sky over Chicago was still pitch black and the cold wind off Lake Michigan cut sharply through every street. She had just stepped through the hospital's employee entrance and pulled the collar of her coat higher when the phone in her pocket gave a brief vibration. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Very few people had this number, only the hospital department that coordinated work schedules, and no one else in the world. Her fingers went rigid, not from the cold, as she pulled out the phone, and the screen lit up in the darkness with a message from an unidentified number. "You've become very good at running, Sadie, but you forgot that every nurse's record has to pass through a verification system. Chicago suits you. I'll be there soon." The ground beneath Sadie's feet seemed to collapse. She stood frozen on the empty sidewalk, reading those 4 short sentences again and again, while the sound of her own breathing thundered inside her ears like drums. He had found her. After all those months of living like a shadow, with no friends, no social media, and no trace left behind, that predator had still managed to follow the single fragile thread she had been forced to leave. Panic crashed over her like a wave breaking through a levee. Sadie couldn't remember how she had run from the train station back to the Meridian. She only knew that when she rushed through the lobby, the night receptionist called after her to ask whether she was all right, and she didn't have enough breath to answer. Inside the elevator, she pressed the button for the 9th floor again and again, as though pressing it faster could make the elevator move faster. Her back flattened against the wall of the car, and her eyes fixed on the narrow seam between the doors. When she reached apartment 9B, she locked the door, fastened the safety latch, then leaned against the steel door and slowly slid down to the floor. Her mind immediately shifted into the state that 3 years of hell had trained into an instinctive response, the state of escape. She forced herself up, dragged the old travel bag from beneath the bed, and began stuffing it with clothes, documents, and her emergency supply of medication, her movements practiced with the heartbreaking precision of someone who had done this far too many times. Where could she go? The question echoed through her mind while her hands continued hurriedly folding a sweater. Denver, Seattle, or somewhere farther south. Atlanta, New Orleans. The names of cities passed through her thoughts like playing cards, and one by one, every card turned over to reveal the same blank white face. Wherever she went, she would have to begin again inside the same old cycle, find a place to live, find a job, and then one day be forced to enter her name into some system, simply to survive, and he would find her again because he had money, connections, and the diseased patience of a man who had made hunting her the purpose of his life. Sadie's hands began to slow, then stopped completely above the open bag. She looked at the crumpled belongings inside, and a cold truth seeped into her, colder even than the wind blowing off Lake Michigan. Her plan to run had failed before it had even begun, not because she lacked determination, but because this escape was nothing more than a circle with no way out. A person could only keep running when there was still somewhere ahead to go, and she had nowhere. She sat down on the floor in the middle of the dark apartment without turning on a light, drawing both knees tightly against her chest. Beyond the glass window, Chicago was beginning to stir into a new day. Distant windows lit up one after another as ordinary people awakened to ordinary lives she had long since stopped allowing herself to dream about. Sadie removed the old nurse's watch from her wrist and held it between her palms as though she were sheltering a small bird. The metal casing had been worn smooth at the corners, and a diagonal scratch marked the glass from the day her mother had caught a falling patient in a hospital room. The second hand still moved forward one beat at a time, patient, steady, never surrendering. "Mom," she whispered into the darkness, "what would you do if you were me?" Her mother, a nurse, had remained standing through shifts that lasted 36 hours, had held the hands of dying people so they wouldn't have to leave this world alone, and had taught her daughter that fear wasn't something to be ashamed of, but abandoning yourself was. Sadie's tears fell onto the glass of the watch, and she remained there for a long time, weeping soundlessly in the dark apartment, weeping for 3 years imprisoned by fear, for all those months of living as though she were already dead, and for the 24-year-old woman she had once been, the woman who believed a white lab coat could protect her from every evil thing in the world. Then, at some point, the tears ran dry, and in the silent emptiness they left behind, something inside Sadie quietly changed, like a broken joint slipping itself back into its proper place. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, put the watch around her wrist again, and fastened the clasp securely. She stood, walked toward the travel bag lying open on the bed, and with slow, deliberate movements, removed each item and returned it to its place. The sweater to the dresser drawer, the documents to the desk, and the medicine to the bathroom shelf. She folded the empty bag and pushed it deep beneath the bed. This time, she wouldn't run. That decision didn't come from courage. Sadie was honest enough with herself to understand that. It came from reaching the very end of the road, where a person realized there was nowhere left to flee, and when there was no path backward, there was only one direction left to face, and that was forward. She would stay in Chicago. She would continue working, continue living, continue breathing, and endure one day at a time for as long as she could endure. Sadie walked to the window and, for the first time in a very long while, pulled the thick curtain slightly open, allowing the silver-gray light of a Chicago dawn to spill into the apartment. On the other side of the wall, inside apartment 9A, there was a man who hadn't slept either, and fate, with its own cruel way of arranging things, had already begun counting down to the rainy night that would push those two strangers onto the same side of the boundary between life and death. 3 days after the night she received that message, Sadie was still living like someone walking across a sheet of thin ice, every step cautious, every sound making her heart leap. That night was one of her rare nights off, and the first rain of early winter had been falling steadily since the afternoon, tapping against the window pane like patient fingers. Near midnight, Sadie gathered the trash bag from the kitchen, stood behind the door, and pressed her eye to the peephole as part of the ritual she knew by heart. She watched the silent hallway for a long while before turning the lock and stepping outside, intending to hurry to the trash room at the end of the corridor and come straight back. But she had taken only a few steps when she stopped. Across the cream-colored carpet that ran the length of the 9th-floor hallway, beneath the pale yellow glow of the wall lamps, dark stains formed a broken trail. For the first second, her mind still tried to cling to harmless explanations. Someone had spilled wine. Someone had dropped something. But only for a second, because the eyes of an emergency nurse had seen that liquid far too many times to mistake it for anything else. It was blood. Fresh blood, not yet fully dry, dark red beneath the lights, and the stains grew wider and heavier in one direction, leading straight to the door of apartment 9A. Sadie stood rooted in the hallway, unaware of the moment the trash bag slipped from her hand. The door to apartment 9A wasn't closed. It stood open by a narrow crack, and around the lock, the heavy wood had been torn apart into jagged splinters, the unmistakable mark of a door, forced open with tremendous strength. Inside, there was absolute silence, a silence more terrifying than any sound. Run. The instinct that had kept her alive through all those years screamed inside her in the same voice it always used. Go back to your apartment. Lock the door. Call the police. This isn't your problem. But the instant the thought of the police appeared, another thought stopped it cold. Calling the police meant a report. It meant paperwork. It meant the name Sadie Monroe would enter the Chicago Police Department's database that very night. And with Preston's connections and bottomless money, he would see that name within hours. The message from 3 days earlier was still on her phone. "I'll be there soon." Calling the police to escape the danger behind this door would mean delivering herself into the hands of another danger, one even more patient and more merciless. Sadie stood in the middle of the hallway, trapped between two fears, while the rain continued its steady tapping overhead. And in that moment of torment, her eyes fell once more to the bloodstains on the carpet. This amount of blood hadn't come from a small cut. Her nurse's mind began analyzing it before she could stop herself. A wide stain, continuous dripping, drag marks. Whoever was inside had been losing blood heavily and had still been able to move when entering the apartment, which meant the person was alive, and someone losing blood at this rate wouldn't remain alive much longer unless the bleeding was stopped quickly. The man from apartment 9A, the man who had picked up her keys with that gentle indifference, might be dying less than 10 steps away from her. Her mother had once told her that fear wasn't shameful, but abandoning yourself was, and abandoning someone who was slowly dying was worse still. Sadie's feet moved forward on their own. The instinct of the nurse crushed the instinct of the fugitive, and she heard her own voice speak softly through the narrow opening in the door. "Is anyone there?" "I'm a nurse. I can help." There was no answer. She placed her hand against the cold door and pushed gently. The heavy door swung inward without a sound, revealing a vast space submerged in the dim glow of the city, shining through an enormous wall of glass overlooking rain-soaked Chicago. And there, in the middle of the dark living room, the man from apartment 9A was slumped on the floor, half sitting and half lying down, his back resting against the leg of a low glass table. The white shirt he wore was no longer white. A large, dark red stain spread across his left side, widening with every labored breath. His eyes were half closed, and the face that was usually so cold and severe had gone pale beneath the city lights. Sadie stepped across the threshold, and the instant the toe of her shoe touched the wooden floor, the man who had seemed completely exhausted came awake with unbelievable speed. His right arm rose in the blink of an eye, and Sadie found herself staring directly into the black muzzle of a handgun aimed at the center of her forehead, held with astonishing steadiness despite the body of the man holding it trembling from blood loss. His fathomless dark eyes opened wide, clouded by pain but still sharp as blades, locking onto her. "Give me one reason not to pull the trigger," he said, his hoarse voice grinding through clenched teeth. Time seemed to freeze. An ordinary woman would have screamed, begged, or collapsed to her knees. But 3 years of living in fear had taught Sadie something no school could ever teach: that when terror reached its absolute limit, a person either shattered or became strangely still, and the emergency department had taught her the rest. That a calm voice was the first life-saving tool, even before needles and bandages. Slowly, she raised both hands to shoulder height, spreading her palms so he could see they were empty. And when she spoke, her voice was level and steady, as though she were reading vital signs beside a hospital bed. "Because you're in hemorrhagic shock," she said. "Your skin is pale, your lips have lost their color, and your hand is shaking even though you're trying to hold it still. Judging from the blood you left along the hallway and the pool spreading beneath your side, I estimate you've lost nearly 1/4 of your circulating blood volume. If you pull the trigger, the recoil will make you lose consciousness before I even hit the floor. But if you lower the gun, I'm an emergency nurse, and I can keep you alive through tonight." For a long silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, the wounded man stared deep into Sadie's eyes, as though weighing every word she had spoken on an invisible scale he had spent his entire life using to judge people. Then the arm holding the gun slowly lowered, and the handgun moved out of aim before coming to rest on the wooden floor beside his thigh, though his fingers still hadn't fully released it. "Lock the door," he said, each word escaping with difficulty between 2 labored breaths. "No emergency services. No hospital. No one." Sadie gave one firm nod. This wasn't the time to argue, and this man clearly preferred dying on his own floor to lying in a hospital bed beneath a record bearing his name, something she, a woman also hiding from every system of paperwork in the world, understood better than anyone. "I need to get supplies from my apartment," she said. 30 seconds. Don't shoot me when I come back." One corner of his pale mouth twitched slightly. It might have been pain, or it might have been the closest thing to a smile he could still manage. And Sadie chose to believe the second possibility. She rushed back to apartment 9B, pulled the medical bag she always kept fully stocked from the cabinet beneath the sink, a professional habit she had never been able to abandon, then returned to apartment 9A, locked the broken door behind her, and wedged a heavy chair beneath the doorknob. Then she knelt beside him, and the world around her narrowed until there was nothing left but one patient, one wound, and her own 2 hands. She put on gloves and used scissors to cut along the length of his blood-soaked shirt, carefully peeling the fabric that clung to his skin away from his body. The wound appeared beneath his left ribs, a long, deep gash with clean, precise edges. The mark of a professional blade rather than a wild and chaotic stabbing. Sadie quietly recorded that detail in one corner of her mind, then pushed it aside. Because her work was to save lives, not ask questions. She pressed sterile gauze firmly against the wound with the full weight of both hands, counting the beats inside her head, feeling his pulse beneath the thin gloves. It was rapid but still strong enough, not yet at the critical threshold, though no longer far from it. "This is going to hurt," she warned briefly, before pouring antiseptic solution along the edges of the wound. The man's abdominal muscles tightened into stone, and his knuckles turned white as his fingers dug into the wooden floor, but he didn't make a sound. Only a faint breath hissed through his clenched teeth. "I've seen firefighters cry when I do this part," Sadie said as she threaded the needle, her voice remaining even, as though she were discussing the weather. That was how the emergency department had taught her to keep patients conscious, to anchor them to the sound of her voice instead of letting them sink into shock. "Firefighters don't get stabbed every month," he replied, his voice rough but every word clear, and Sadie glanced quickly at his pale face, unsure whether to call what he had just said a joke or a confession, then decided not to call it anything at all. She lowered her head and continued working. The needle passed through his skin in a perfectly steady rhythm, each stitch falling into a straight line as the wound gradually closed, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed the same motion thousands of times during long nights in the emergency department. Never faster than necessary, never slower than time allowed. The man endured in silence, but she could feel his eyes never leaving her hands, watching, evaluating, and gradually relaxing with the wary surrender of a wild animal, allowing a stranger to touch its wound for the first time. Trust grew between them in silence, not through promises, but through each careful, orderly stitch. When she tied the final knot and began wrapping a pressure bandage around his torso, his gaze settled on her wrist, where the old nurse's watch showed beneath the edge of her glove, its worn metal casing reflecting the city lights. "Whose watch is that?" he asked. The question made Sadie's hands pause for an instant, because during all her months in Chicago, no one had ever noticed it, and the first person to see it was the man who had just pointed a gun at her. "It belonged to my mother," she answered. "She was a nurse too." He said nothing more, and only gave one slow, faint nod. But in those fathomless dark eyes, already dimming with exhaustion, Sadie saw something stir, as though her simple answer had touched a room inside him that he himself had locked away long ago. She gave him the only bag of intravenous fluid she had brought, hanging it from the back of a chair, placed pillows beneath his legs to help the blood return to his heart, and covered him with a blanket to keep him warm, the small and quiet duties of those who kept watch over life through the night. After midnight, a mild fever arrived, just as she had expected. The man drifted into a state between sleep and consciousness, his head tilting to one side as his breathing slowly deepened. And in that haze, his dry, cracked lips moved and released a name so softly that Sadie had to lean closer to hear it. Bella. Only one name, spoken in a voice she had never heard from him before, neither cold nor sharp, but weighted down like a wound far older than the blade cut beneath his ribs. Sadie sat quietly beside him. She didn't ask and didn't touch him. She only pulled the edge of the blanket back over his body. Everyone carried certain names with them into the darkness, and she understood that better than anyone. She stayed awake beside him through the remaining hours of the night, checking his pulse, checking the bandage, adjusting the position of the intravenous line, until the sky beyond the glass wall slowly changed from black to ash gray, and his breathing became even, steady, and safe. Before the first light of day touched Lake Michigan, Sadie gathered her supplies and left a packet of painkillers, antibiotics, and a small note containing only a few lines of dosage instructions on the glass table, unsigned. She stood looking at the sleeping man for one final second, then slipped through the doorway and returned to apartment 9B, repeating an order to herself. Forget tonight. Forget the knife wound. Forget the gun. Forget even the name Bella. Pretend none of it ever happened. But there was one thing Sadie didn't know. Before she had even finished closing her own door, somewhere in the waking city, the phone of a man named Rocco had already lit up, and in the world of those who lived around apartment 9A, the face of the nurse from the 9th floor had been remembered, carefully and forever. In the same way that world remembered everyone who had ever seen their boss's blood. Sadie had slept for only a few hours when a knock sounded at the door. 3 crisp, perfectly even knocks. Neither hurried nor willing to let anyone pretend they hadn't heard. She sprang upright in bed, her heart pounding, and for one terrifying moment, she thought immediately of Preston, convinced he had arrived even faster than his own threat had promised. She crept toward the door, pressed her eye to the peephole, and saw a middle-aged man standing in the center of the hallway, his build as square and solid as a steel cabinet, dressed in a neatly pressed charcoal gray suit, his hands clasped in front of him, with the posture of someone accustomed to waiting outside important doors. It wasn't Preston, but he wasn't a delivery man either. Sadie opened the door slightly, leaving the safety latch fastened, and through that narrow opening, the man inclined his head toward her with a degree of formal courtesy that felt strangely out of place. "My name is Rocco," he said in a deep, composed voice. "I work for the man you helped last night. He's awake, his vital signs are stable, and I was sent here to convey his gratitude." Then he reached inside his suit jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope, so thick that Sadie didn't need to open it to know what was inside, and held it toward the gap with both hands, as though presenting an offering in some solemn ritual. "He would like you to accept this as a token of his gratitude," Rocco said, "and he asked me to tell you that the amount inside is only a beginning. If you feel it isn't enough, you need only name another figure." Sadie stared at the envelope for a long time. The money inside was probably equal to an entire year of her nursing salary, perhaps more, enough for her to disappear once again if necessary, enough to purchase many more months of safety. But she had seen too clearly how money worked in the hands of powerful men. She had watched Preston use it to buy the silence of an entire board, to buy the signatures of people who had once called her their colleague. And she understood a truth that 3 years of hell had carved into her bones. When you accepted someone's money, you handed them a rope, and sooner or later, that rope would be pulled. She gently shook her head and pushed the envelope back through the gap with firm fingers. "I didn't save him in exchange for anything," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm a nurse. When I see someone dying, I help them. That's all there is to it." Then she paused, looked directly into the eyes of the man named Rocco through the narrow opening, and said what she truly needed. "If he wants to thank me, tell him I need only one thing. All of you must forget that I exist." Rocco studied her for a long moment, and in the seasoned eyes of that man, something very much like carefully concealed astonishment flickered. He slipped the envelope back inside his jacket, inclined his head to her once more deeply than before, then turned away without saying another word. The door to apartment 9B closed, and Sadie leaned against it, releasing a long breath, believing the matter had ended there. She couldn't have known that less than 10 minutes later, inside apartment 9A, her exact words were repeated to a man sitting against the back of a leather chair with bandages wrapped around his torso, and that the man remained silent for a very long time after hearing them. Enzo Barone had lived for 33 years, and for 15 of those years, he had stood at the summit of a world where every person had a price. Experience had taught him that everyone wanted something: money, power, protection, or a favor to be saved for later. He had met every kind of person who would kneel before his wealth, as well as those who pretended to refuse it, only to demand a higher price. But a woman who walked empty, handed through a pool of blood to save a stranger, pointing a gun at her, then refused a fortune the next morning and asked only to be forgotten, had no place on any scale he had ever used. A person only longed to become invisible with such desperation when she was fleeing something more terrifying than death itself. "Find out everything about her," he told Rocco, quietly. "She mustn't know, and I want to know who she's running from." 2 days later, a thin file was placed on his desk, and Enzo read it in silence from the first page to the last, his jaw tightening with every page. Sadie Monroe, 27 years old, had once been an exceptional nurse at a major hospital in Philadelphia, with a professional record untouched by even the smallest blemish, until she filed a formal complaint against a renowned heart surgeon named Preston Hale. The hospital board dismissed the complaint after a brief private meeting. 3 weeks later, her name appeared in a medication error report involving a mistake that had nearly killed a patient, an error supported by a trail of paperwork so flawless that it became suspicious, and her career was crushed within a single autumn. Her license was suspended, her name was blackened throughout the entire system, and one door after another closed in an order so precise it seemed programmed. This wasn't bad luck, Enzo understood by the second page. This was a carefully directed destruction, carried out by someone with power, money, and the patience of a predator. He closed the file and sat motionless beside the glass wall, looking down at the city for a long while, then gave a single order. Increase the security presence on the 9th floor. Keep it discreet. No one is to let her notice. He sent Sadie no message, offered no thanks, and made no promises, because in his world, the best protection was the kind the person being protected never knew existed. But alongside the file on the nurse, another question had been smoldering inside Enzo's mind since the night he had collapsed beside the glass table, with the blade wound still burning beneath his ribs. A question he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone, not even Rocco. His attacker had known exactly which stretch of street he would cross alone, at what hour, and on which night. Information that existed only inside an encrypted schedule, accessible to fewer people than the fingers on one hand. There was another detail as well, a small one, but in his profession, small details decided who lived and who died. The 9th floor camera system had been scheduled for maintenance on that exact night, a coincidence so perfect that it couldn't possibly have been a coincidence. Someone inside his organization had opened the door and allowed that blade to enter. Enzo sat in the darkness of apartment 9A, one hand resting against the bandages beneath his ribs, and began doing what he did best, remaining silent, watching, and waiting for the traitor to step into the light. The weeks that followed passed in a kind of peace Sadie didn't dare name, as though speaking it aloud would cause it to disappear. She continued working night shifts and returning home before dawn, and during the quietest hours of the building, she kept crossing paths with the man from apartment 9A. At 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 exhausted people would step into the same elevator, silently watching the floor numbers change one by one. But the silence between them was no longer what it had once been. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers, but the silence of 2 people who shared a secret stitched together with medical thread and sealed with blood. Sometimes he gave her a faint nod when the elevator doors opened. Sometimes she caught his gaze lingering on her face for longer than a second, breaking the 1-second limit he had never crossed with anyone, and her heart would miss a beat before she silently scolded herself for it. Then one night, 3 crisp knocks sounded at the door of apartment 9B, but this time there was something more urgent in them, and when Sadie opened the door, Enzo stood there with one hand pressed against his left side, a dark red stain seeping between his fingers. "The stitches opened," he said briefly, as though announcing the weather. She pulled him inside, pushed him into a chair, and this time, everything happened beneath the bright lights of her apartment, amid the familiar smell of antiseptic, with no gun barrel and no boundary between life and death, only one stubborn patient and one frowning nurse. "What did you do to it?" she asked, as she removed the old bandage. "All 3 stitches in the middle are torn. This isn't the kind of damage caused by ordinary movement. I started training again too soon," he replied. "What kind of training tears medical sutures?" she asked, never taking her eyes from the wound. "The things I need to train for," he said, and Sadie looked up to find something almost playful, flickering in his eyes, a rare light that suddenly made his cold, severe face appear several years younger. She shook her head, threaded the needle, and began replacing the stitches one by one, more slowly and carefully this time, while words began falling naturally between them, as though distance had never existed. He asked why she had chosen the night shift. She said it was because patients needed the most alert people at night, and because she wasn't very good at sleeping. He said he was the same. That night was when he accomplished most of his work. 2 people awake while the whole city sleeps, she said without thinking, then immediately fell silent because the words sounded far more intimate than she had intended. But Enzo only looked at her and gave the faintest nod. Yes, 2 people awake while the whole city sleeps. After he left that night, Sadie stood beside the window for a long time, reminding herself that he lived in a world she wasn't allowed to enter, that the distance between them existed to protect her, yet one small truth kept slipping through every barrier of reason. For the first time in years, someone had made her forget she was supposed to be afraid. Then the cups of coffee began appearing. The first morning, when Sadie dragged herself home after a long shift, she nearly stepped on one. A paper cup of coffee had been placed neatly outside the door of apartment 9B, steam still rising through the opening in the lid, with no note and no message. She stood looking at it for a long while as her old caution awakened, but then she thought of the man across the hall, a man who didn't know how to say thank you but whose entire world seemed to function through unspoken gestures, and a small smile found its way to her lips. She carried the coffee inside, drank it beside the window, and felt warmth spreading through her in a way she had almost forgotten. The next morning, another cup appeared in the same place, still hot, as though someone had carefully timed it for the moment she came home. Then came a third morning and a fourth, each cup arriving with the steadiness of a greeting that required no reply. Sadie began looking forward to them. Each morning when she stepped out of the elevator, her eyes went first to the space outside her door, and in her mind, every cup of coffee became a quiet message from the man in apartment 9A. I know you've spent the night keeping watch over life. Go inside and rest. Until the sixth morning, when she happened to meet Enzo in the hallway. He had just stepped out of the elevator after a night spent somewhere in his own world, and Sadie, still holding the warm cup of coffee, smiled at him for the first time since the night of the blood. Thank you for the coffee, she said. You didn't have to do that, but it really made the night shifts much easier. Enzo stopped walking. He turned fully toward her, and on the face that never revealed anything, Sadie saw a change that made the blood in her body slowly turn cold even before he spoke. I didn't leave anything outside your door, he said, each word slow and clear. The cup in Sadie's hand suddenly felt as heavy as stone. She looked down at it, at the thin ribbon of steam still rising innocently through the lid, and the warmth she had felt through 6 mornings turned inside out, becoming a cold current that traveled down her spine. If it wasn't you, she heard herself whisper, then who knew exactly when I came home every morning? No one answered the question, but they both understood what it meant. Someone had watched her long enough to memorize the rhythm of her life, and that person didn't want to remain hidden. On the contrary, that person wanted her to accept the gift every morning, wanted her to drink it, wanted her to smile, so that one day she would realize whose hand had placed it there. It wasn't a gift, it was a message. I am very close. Enzo took the coffee from her hand with a gentle but decisive motion. Don't drink anything again unless you know exactly where it came from. Then he pulled out his phone, and for the first time, Sadie heard the voice he used when giving orders, still deep, but sharp as a newly honed blade. Rocco, review every camera on the 9th floor and in the lobby from the past 6 days. I want to know who came to the door of apartment 9B every morning. The answer arrived that evening, and it was more frightening than having no answer at all. 6 mornings, 6 cups of coffee, and not a single frame of footage had captured the person who left them. Whoever it was had moved through the 9th floor like a ghost, slipping between camera angles with the precision of someone who possessed the layout of every camera, who knew exactly where each blind spot began, and how many seconds passed before the camera's reversed direction. Enzo remained motionless before the screen for a long time after Rocco finished his report. A stranger couldn't have done that. Only someone who knew the Meridian's security system from the inside could move through it that way. And the realization closed like a freezing circle around his chest, connecting directly to the scheduled camera maintenance on the night he was stabbed. This refuge had been infiltrated long ago, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Across the hallway, Sadie locked her door, fastened the latch, closed the curtains, and for the first time since moving into the Meridian, realized that her fortress might never have been a fortress at all. The poster was pinned to the department bulletin board on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by duty schedules and internal notices. An elegant poster printed in dark blue letters announcing the annual Midwestern Regional Cardiovascular Conference at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and Sadie walked past it twice without stopping, until the third time, when her eyes accidentally fell upon the list of invited speakers printed formally near the bottom. Time seemed to stop. On the 4th line of the list, buried among an imposing collection of academic titles and credentials, was the name she had spent nearly a year running from: Dr. Preston Hale, cardiac surgeon, keynote speaker. The hospital corridor around her was still filled with the sounds of rolling carts and announcements over the speakers. But Sadie could no longer hear any of it. She stood frozen before the poster, feeling every letter of that name crawl across her skin like insects. He was no longer following her with private investigators or anonymous phone calls. He had done what only the most intelligent predators would think to do. He had used the medical system itself, the very world she was forced to live within in order to survive, as his hunting net. He had entered Chicago openly through the front doors, welcomed with ceremony, treated with respect, and introduced to applause. Sadie considered changing shifts, calling in sick, disappearing from the hospital for the entire week of the conference. But the schedule had already been finalized, and every unusual absence left behind a question, and a question was something she couldn't afford to leave. So she chose the way of a small animal during hunting season. She kept her head down, moved quickly, avoided the main corridors, ate lunch in the changing room, and for the first 2 days of the conference, it worked. On the third day, it didn't. She had just finished handing over her shift and was walking along the deserted administrative corridor toward the employee exit when a voice sounded behind her, smooth, polished, and so familiar that her stomach twisted into a dead knot. Sadie. She didn't turn around immediately. For 1,000th of a second, some part of her still prayed that she had heard wrong, but the calm footsteps approaching from behind answered for her. Preston Hale stood there in a dark blue suit without a single crease, a speaker's badge pinned to his chest, his hair carefully styled, and his smile adjusted to perfection. He looked exactly like the photographs in medical journals, and that was the most frightening part, because Sadie knew what lay beneath that surface. He didn't touch her. He had never been careless enough to touch her in public. He only stepped closer, one step nearer than courtesy allowed, close enough for the scent of his cologne to invade the air she breathed, close enough for his voice to fall into the private volume meant only for the two of them, the volume of those locked rooms from long ago. "You've lost weight," he said, his voice gentle like that of a concerned older brother. "Chicago hasn't been taking very good care of you." Sadie stood straight, her arms hanging at her sides, her fingernails digging into her palms, and she poured everything she had learned in the emergency department into keeping her face as still as the surface of a frozen lake. "I'm working, Dr. Hale," she said, her voice so even that it surprised even her. "Excuse me." She stepped aside to continue walking, but he moved with her in the same rhythm, not fully blocking her path, only enough to force her to stop, and in his eyes, the light she had spent 3 years learning to read flickered to life, pleasure, possession, patience. "You're still angry with me," he sighed, as though she were a stubborn child. "You've run all across this country, changed your name, changed your hair, lived in hiding like a criminal. And for what, Sadie?" He tilted his head and lowered his voice another degree, each word falling slowly, sharpened to cut as deeply as possible. "No city can hide you from me. You know that, because I'm the only person in this world who understands you, the only one patient enough for you. Everyone else will leave once they realize how difficult you are. Only I stay. Only I always find you." He smiled, nodded as though ending a pleasant social conversation, and said, "I'll see you again soon," then walked leisurely toward the auditorium, leaving Sadie standing in the corridor with her heart beating wildly behind a frozen mask. She couldn't remember how she left the hospital, how she boarded the train, or how many times she changed lines out of the old habit of losing anyone who might be following her. The trembling didn't truly begin until she stepped out of the elevator on the 9th floor of the Meridian, when her body realized it had reached the one place where it was allowed to collapse. Her fingers shook so violently that the keys rattled against one another. She tried to insert the key into the lock the first time and missed. The second time, she missed again, metal scraping against metal. And on the third attempt, a soft sound came from behind her, the door of apartment 9A opening. Enzo stood in the doorway, and with one glance, he saw everything. The keys moving out of rhythm in her bloodless hand, her shoulders held rigid, the shallow, rapid breathing of someone who had just run from something her legs could never escape. "Who frightened you?" he asked. 4 words, no greeting, no careful introduction, and it was that naked directness that did what no comforting words could have done. It broke through the dam Sadie had spent nearly a year building. She turned to look at him, her lips trembling, and then everything poured out, there in the hallway at first, and then beside the table inside apartment 9A, after he silently opened the door and led her in. Everything, fully and completely, told to another human being for the first time. She told him about Philadelphia, about the celebrated doctor worshipped by the entire hospital, and the young nurse who had once admired him like an idol, about the midnight messages that slowly became commands, the gifts she wasn't allowed to refuse, the way he appeared everywhere she went, about the burn scar on the back of her hand from the day she told him to his face to leave her alone, about the complaint that was smothered after one private meeting, and the medication error that appeared from nowhere and crushed her career, about fleeing across state lines, and about the man who had stood one step away from her in the hospital that afternoon and told her that no city could hide her from him. Enzo listened in absolute silence. He didn't interrupt her once, didn't ask her to repeat anything, didn't pour her a glass of water to fill the empty spaces as people often did. He only sat there, motionless, his eyes never leaving her face, and his silence wasn't empty. It grew heavier with every detail she gave him, like darkness thickening before a storm. When Sadie finished, exhausted, her hands still locked tightly together on the tabletop, the room remained silent for a long while, with only the city lights glittering beyond the glass wall. Then Enzo stood, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't louder than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a sealed sentence passed down in a world where there was no appeal. He will never touch you again. 2 days after the encounter at the hospital, a package was delivered to the Meridian, addressed to Miss Monroe in apartment 9B. The receptionist called upstairs and said the box had been brought by a delivery service. All the paperwork was in order, and nothing appeared unusual. Sadie stood beside the lobby desk for a long time, staring at the neat square box wrapped in elegant brown paper, before finally reaching out to take it. There was no sender's name. There was only her own name, written in a perfectly even slanted hand that she recognized immediately, the same handwriting she had seen on hundreds of medical orders in Philadelphia, the handwriting the entire department had once praised as the most beautiful in the hospital. Sadie's legs carried her into the elevator, up to the 9th floor, and into her apartment, like those of a sleepwalker. She placed the box on the table and sat watching it in silence for nearly 10 minutes before forcing herself to cut through the wrapping paper. Beneath the neatly folded white tissue paper was a small velvet box, and when Sadie opened its lid, the world around her collapsed without a sound. Resting perfectly against the lining was a nurse's watch, an old-fashioned pin-on style with a round metal case, a white face, and slender second markings, identical to her mother's watch in every detail. The same brand, the same model, even the same kind of clasp that had stopped being manufactured 20 years earlier. There was only one difference. This watch was brand new, bright and polished, with no diagonal scratch across the glass, and no worn corners from tens of thousands of shifts, like a flawless and soulless copy of the most sacred keepsake in her life. Beneath the watch lay a white card, and on it, in that same perfectly even slanted handwriting, was a single line. "I know everything about you." Sadie didn't cry right away. The shock had struck somewhere deeper than tears could reach. She sat motionless before the open box, while the true meaning of the gift slowly took shape inside her mind, with all the calculated cruelty behind it. He hadn't merely discovered where she lived. He had dug backward into the very roots of her life, into the memory of her dead mother who had been a nurse, into the old watch she had never once told him about, the watch she had always kept hidden beneath her sleeve throughout her years in Philadelphia. And he had found an identical one, only to tell her that there wasn't a single room inside her memories he hadn't entered, that nothing belonging to her, not even the dead, not even the most sacred things, lay beyond his reach. It wasn't a gift. It was an invasion. Sadie's hand began to shake, then her arm, then her entire body, and she didn't know when she had left her apartment. She only knew that when her awareness returned, she was standing outside the door of apartment 9A with the velvet box in her hand. The door was already open, and Enzo was standing there looking at her, then down at the brand new watch inside the box, then at the words on the card she held out with a hand that could no longer remain steady. He didn't ask a single question. He only reached out and took the box from her as gently as though removing a piece of shrapnel, then opened the door wider. "Come inside." That night, Sadie sat for a long time in the familiar leather chair inside apartment 9A, wrapped in the thin blanket he had given her, looking through the glass wall at Chicago, stretching beneath them like a silent sea of lights. The trembling had faded, but what remained was heavier, a weariness deep in her bones, the exhaustion of someone who had just understood that the man hunting her didn't merely want to capture her. He wanted to erode every part of her soul first. "He wants me to understand that nothing belongs only to me anymore," she said softly into the open space. "Not even my mother, not even my memories." Enzo stood beside the glass wall with his back to the city and remained silent for a long while. Then he did something Sadie hadn't expected. He pulled the chair opposite her closer, sat down at her eye level, and in a voice lower and slower than usual, opened a door she suspected he had kept locked against the entire world for a very long time. "I had a younger brother," he said. "His name was Nino. He was 4 years younger than me, and he was the only person in this world I trusted without conditions. 6 years ago, someone inside our own organization sold his schedule to the enemy, and he was ambushed aboard our family's cargo ship in the harbor, a ship named Bella after my mother. He never came home." He paused, his eyes never leaving Sadie's face, and in those fathomless dark eyes, she saw the bottom of an abyss he had never allowed anyone else to see. "I became the man I am today after that night," he continued, "and I have only one rule I never break. I can forgive an enemy because an enemy is only doing what an enemy is meant to do, but I never forgive a traitor." 4 sentences, nothing more, no recreation of the scene, no tears, but Sadie understood that he had just given her the equivalent of what she had given him in the hallway that night, the rawest truth of his life, and suddenly she understood the name he had spoken in his delirium on that first night. Bella wasn't a woman from his past. Bella was the ship, his mother, his younger brother, everything he had lost gathered into 2 syllables. 2 people sat facing one another in a room high above the sea of Chicago lights. One whose memories had been invaded by a predator, the other whose own blood had been taken by a traitor. And in the long silence that followed, neither of them said anything else, because nothing more was necessary. Some forms of understanding don't pass through words. They are simply 2 wounds recognizing each other in the darkness, resting quietly side by side, hurting a little less. When Sadie stood to leave near dawn, Enzo walked her to the door, and just before she crossed the hallway, he spoke one final sentence. It wasn't a sweet promise, only a truth delivered in the voice of a man capable of turning words into reality. "Your mother's watch is real. The one in that box is false. Don't let a copy make you forget that the original is still on your wrist, and no one will take it from you as long as I am on the other side of this hallway." The thought came to Sadie on an afternoon that seemed harmless, while she was reorganizing the drawer where she kept her documents, and came across a copy of her own lease. She had intended to put it away as she always did, but this time, after the nameless coffee and the false watch, her mind had learned to examine everything beneath a different kind of light, the light of suspicion. And under that light, the familiar pages suddenly revealed cracks she had never allowed herself to see. Her rental application was fraudulent, and she knew that better than anyone because she had created it herself. An employment reference from a clinic that had already closed, a paper-thin credit history belonging to a name that had existed for barely more than a year, and a reference contact that led to a prepaid phone, she answered herself. The Meridian was a luxury building in the heart of River North, where, according to the leasing agent, the waiting list stretched for months, and every application was examined down to the smallest comma, yet her patched-together file had been approved in only 2 days, without a single verification call or one additional question, so smoothly that she had knelt in the middle of the empty apartment that day and thanked fate. Now, sitting on the floor with the file resting across her lap, Sadie felt her spine growing colder as each link connected to the next. The absolute silence of the 9th floor, the men in suits in the parking garage who never looked at her for more than a second but were never absent. The only door opposite hers belonged to the most powerful man in the city. Nothing in that picture was accidental, and the real question wasn't how she had managed to rent apartment 9B, but who had allowed her to rent it. That evening, when Enzo opened the door of apartment 9A, he found Sadie standing in the hallway with the lease file in her hands and a question sharpened in her eyes. "My application is full of holes," she said directly, without introduction. An intern at the property management company could have seen them, yet it was approved in 2 days. "Tell me the truth. Was apartment 9B really a coincidence?" Enzo looked at her for a long moment, and Sadie had to acknowledge one thing. He didn't blink, didn't evade the question, and didn't pretend to be surprised the way liars often did. He only opened the door wider. "Come inside. This shouldn't be discussed in the hallway." Once she was standing in the familiar room, he poured her a glass of water, placed it on the table, then spoke in the level, direct voice of a man who had decided he wouldn't owe her another truth. "The entire 9th floor belongs to me," he said. "Apartment 9B, apartment 9C at the far end, this entire hallway, all of it is part of a building I own through 3 layers of companies. No one rents the apartment across from my door unless my people have turned over every page of that person's life. Your application sat on my desk for 2 days. Yes, it was full of holes, but those holes told a very clear story. A woman alone, no organization behind her, No weapons. No criminal past. Only one need: to disappear. Too clean. Too faint. Harmless. Those were the 3 words my people wrote in the report, and I approved it because a neighbor who wanted to remain invisible was the safest neighbor a man like me could hope for. The room fell silent. Sadie stood motionless, and what she felt in her chest wasn't exactly anger. It was more complicated than that. It was the feeling of someone who had just discovered that the map she had used to escape had been drawn in advance by someone else. For nearly a year, she had been proud of her fortress, proud that even at her most desperate, she had still been clear-minded enough to choose the perfect refuge, proud that at least one decision in her life had belonged entirely to her. "I thought I chose the fortress," she said, her voice quiet but every word falling heavily. "It turns out the fortress chose me. Even my place of refuge wasn't my decision. Do you know what that feels like? To have your entire life arranged by other people. To escape one hand only to discover you're standing in the palm of another." She waited for him to defend himself, waited for him to say he had done it for security, that she should be grateful because it was the reason she had been allowed to live there. All the reasonable arguments a powerful man would use to turn control into a favor. Preston had taught her that speech by heart, but Enzo said none of it. He didn't apologize and didn't explain. He simply stood there and accepted the full force of her gaze, then spoke exactly 2 sentences, slowly, as though setting 2 stones on the table between them. "I chose someone harmless to live beside me. That's how I survived for 33 years. But you're the first person who proved me wrong." Sadie stopped. "Wrong in what way?" she asked. One corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. "A harmless person doesn't walk through a pool of blood to save someone pointing a gun at her," he said. "A harmless person doesn't refuse an envelope containing enough money to buy several years of freedom. A harmless person doesn't stand in my hallway tonight, demanding the truth, instead of running away." I approved the application of a shadow, but the person who moved into apartment 9B was a human being, and that, he paused for a moment, that wasn't part of any calculation I made. The anger inside Sadie's chest faded before she even realized it. Not because his words were sweet, because there was nothing sweet about them, but because they were true, brutally true, and she suddenly saw the painfully amusing symmetry between the 2 people standing in that room. She had watched him through her peephole from the first days, memorized his hours, read him through every sign, and he had been reading her before she ever entered the building, through every page of her file. 2 people hiding from the entire world, watching each other through narrow openings, building walls around themselves, only for fate to confine them to the same hallway. "We really are a perfect pair of paranoid people," she said without thinking, and to her own astonishment, a brief laugh escaped her chest, the first laugh she had given in more months than she could remember. Enzo watched her laugh, and something in his cold, severe face softened in a way no report in his possession could ever have recorded. "I was about to make dinner," he said after a moment of silence, his voice casual as though it were something he said every day. "Pasta. My mother's recipe. You can stay, or you can take some home. The choice is yours. This time, the choice is truly yours." Sadie looked at the man standing in the open kitchen with the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, revealing the bandage still wrapped around his side. Then at the glass wall beyond him where the lights of Chicago had begun to glow, and heard her own voice answer with an unfamiliar calm. "I'll stay." And that was how their first dinner in apartment 9A began. With no candles, no wine, and not a single word about feelings. Only 2 plates of hot pasta, the quiet sound of forks touching ceramic, and 2 people who, for the first time in a very long while, were allowed to sit across from someone without pretending to be anyone else. In a hotel room, overlooking the Chicago River, Preston Hale sat listening to a report he had paid a great deal of money to obtain, and for the first time in many years, the private investigator seated across from him looked less like a man who had come to collect his fee, and more like a man who had come to return it. "I found her address," the man said. "The Meridian in River North, an apartment on the 9th floor. But doctor, that's also why I strongly recommend that you stop pursuing this." Preston raised an eyebrow, and the investigator lowered his voice even though they were the only 2 people in the room. "She lives directly beside Enzo Barone's apartment." The name clearly meant nothing to a surgeon from Philadelphia, so the investigator continued in the tone of a man speaking about an approaching storm. "Barone controls the harbor, controls transportation, controls half of everything that moves through the darkness of this city. The police can't touch him. The press doesn't dare print his name, and the people who once caused him trouble aren't here anymore to tell anyone what happened. The woman you're looking for lives one hallway away from that man. I don't know why, and I don't want to know. Your money is very good, but it isn't that good." The investigator placed the file on the table, stood, and left the room the way a person leaves a burning building. Preston remained alone for a long time, staring down at the distant photograph of the Meridian's front entrance, and inside his chest, what should have been fear transformed into something far more distorted, jealousy. His Sadie, the girl he had spent 3 years shaping, was living beneath another man's shadow, protected by another power, and the thought gnawed at him more violently than losing her trail ever had. Preston didn't sleep that night, and perhaps he would have spent many more nights sitting at the crossroads of obsession and caution, had his phone not lit up with a message from an unidentified number. "I know you're trying to reach apartment 9B, the message said, "and I know what's standing in your way. We should talk." The call came immediately afterward, and the voice on the other end had been altered by machinery. Neither high nor low, neither old nor young, a voice without a face. The caller claimed to be someone inside the Meridian, someone who possessed things no investigator could buy. And to prove it, the caller recited the exact time Sadie left for work every evening, the basement level where she parked, and even the brand of coffee that, as the caller remarked with a dry laugh, the nurse had once enjoyed receiving every morning. Preston tightened his grip on the phone. "What do you want?" he asked. The answer came quickly and smoothly, as though it had already been written. "We have a common problem named Barone. You want the woman. I want him removed from the board. And the wonderful thing is that both desires can be satisfied on the same night." During the days that followed, gifts began arriving for Preston through anonymous electronic mailboxes. Detailed floor plans of the Meridian, with every camera location and blind spot marked in red, the operating code for the emergency stairwell door, and most importantly, a piece of information emphasized as pure gold. On Friday night, Barone would leave the city to handle business at the Milwaukee Harbor, and only the woman would remain on the 9th floor. Along with that information came a name, Blackline, a private security company that accepted contracts without invoices. 4 armed professionals capable of removing a woman from the building in complete silence, and the faceless caller had even arranged the price in advance. Preston transferred the money without bargaining. Inside the doctor's mind, the plan was perfect. The Blackline team would bring Sadie out. He would be waiting below, and this time he would take her somewhere no city would remain for her to run to. He imagined himself a chess player, and spent every night reviewing each move, never once questioning the simplest truth, that pieces this convenient never appeared on the board by accident. Because on the other side of those anonymous messages, the hidden player was playing an entirely different game. To that person, Sadie had never been the target. She was only sweet bait used to lure an obsessed doctor willing to spend freely, and that obsessed doctor was nothing more than a shield, an outsider with an obvious motive and a documented history of stalking the woman in apartment 9, the perfect man to carry every charge once the real plan was complete. The real plan contained only one line: Enzo Barone must not leave the 9th floor alive on Friday night, because the blade in the alley the previous month had missed its mark by only a few centimeters, and the people behind it weren't accustomed to paying for 2 failures. But there was one rule the hidden player had forgotten, despite knowing every camera inside the Meridian by heart. In Enzo Barone's world, information was also a weapon, and weapons could be loaded with false ammunition. On Thursday evening, inside apartment 9A, Rocco placed a phone on the table before Enzo and lowered his voice. "There's movement, sir. Exactly as you predicted. The information that you're leaving for Milwaukee tomorrow night has just been offered for sale through 2 layers of intermediaries. Someone bought it for a very high price, and the buyer is assembling a Blackline team." The room remained silent for a moment. Enzo stood beside the glass wall, looking down at the river of city lights, and across his cold, severe face, a slow smile appeared. A smile without the slightest trace of warmth, the smile of a hunter hearing the trap he set snap shut. The Milwaukee trip had never existed. It was only a name written down and released into one specific internal channel, a channel accessible to only a handful of people. And now that the name had echoed back from the black market, Enzo finally possessed what he had been waiting for throughout those weeks. Not proof on paper, but the direction of the wind. The traitor had taken the bait, and he was personally drawing everyone. The Blackline team, the obsessed doctor, and the people behind the earlier blade, toward the exact place Enzo wanted them to stand. The ninth floor hallway, a battlefield he knew down to every centimeter. "Make the preparations," he told Rocco, without taking his eyes from the city. "Tomorrow night, we'll stay home and welcome our guests." On Friday afternoon, Enzo knocked on the door of apartment 9B, just as Sadie had awakened and was preparing for her shift, and one look at his face was enough for her to know that this wouldn't be an ordinary night. "Call in and take tonight off," he said, his voice no louder than usual but carrying an entirely different weight. "I'll explain after you come over to my place. Bring whatever you'll need for the night." Sadie didn't question him. Over the past several weeks, she had learned that this man never wasted a single word, and if he said she needed to stay inside apartment 9A tonight, it meant apartment 9B was no longer safe. She called the scheduling office and reported that she was sick, lying to miss a shift for the first time in her life, then stood in the middle of her apartment for a moment, looking at the walls that had sheltered her for a year, and while all her old instincts for escape rose up and told her to pack clothes, documents, and cash, her hands did something else first. They reached for the medical bag beneath the sink. When she appeared at the door of apartment 9A with the familiar worn canvas bag over her shoulder, Enzo looked at it, then at her, a silent question in his eyes. "In case you're injured again, I need it," Sadie said simply. "I've stitched you up twice already, and I have no intention of letting the third time happen without the proper supplies." Something passed across Enzo's face, too quickly to name. It might have been gratitude, or it might have been sorrow for someone so accustomed to preparing for the worst. But he only nodded and led her inside. "We're expecting visitors tonight," he said as he guided her through the living room. "They're coming because of me, but I can't rule out the possibility that they know you're on this floor. I could have sent you out of the city this afternoon, but sending you away would mean letting you leave my sight on the very night every blade is pointed here, and that's a risk I won't accept. The safest place in Chicago tonight isn't a hotel or a house in the suburbs. It's behind my wardrobe." He pushed the wooden wardrobe in the bedroom to one side, and the wall behind it wasn't a wall at all. It was a thick steel door with a recessed numerical keypad, something that had never appeared on any blueprint of the building. "I installed it myself," Enzo said as he entered the code. "Not through the management company, not through the building's security team. The workers were brought in from somewhere else and didn't know which address they were installing it for. The electrical system, ventilation, and internal camera feed are all completely separate from the Meridian systems. And this code," he turned to look at her, "is known by only one person in the world." The steel door opened into a small room illuminated by white lights, austere in its simplicity, with a chair, a shelf stocked with water and dry food, and an air purifier humming softly. Nearly an entire wall was occupied by security monitors, divided into many squares, showing the 9th floor hallway, the elevator lobby, the parking garage, and the emergency stairwell, every corner of the outside world reduced to silent images. Sadie stepped inside, placed her medical bag beside the chair, and heard her heart beating slowly but heavily. "It will be loud out there," Enzo said. He stood in the doorway, the white light of the room sharpening the angles of his face. "And on these screens, you'll see things that may make you want to rush outside." He paused and waited until her eyes left the monitors and met his directly. "No matter what you see on those screens, don't open the door. Do you understand me, Sadie? No matter what happens." It was the first time he had called her by name, and in his voice, that name sounded both like an order and a plea disguised as one. "I understand," she said softly. Enzo looked at her for one more second, as though committing her face to some hidden place inside himself. Then the steel door closed between them with a deep, solid locking sound, leaving Sadie alone with the steady hum of the air purifier and 9 silent screens. The first few hours passed as slowly as tar. Through the monitors, she watched the signs of something wrong grow through small details. The lobby was completely empty, even though the evening had only just begun. The familiar receptionist was nowhere to be seen, and the front desk stood abandoned. Then, at around 9 o'clock, half the lights in the 9th floor hallway quietly went dark, leaving the corridor submerged in the dim glow of the remaining lamps, and Sadie suddenly understood that all of this had been arranged, one light at a time, the way someone lowered the lights on a stage before a performance began. She sat on the edge of the chair, her eyes fixed on the screen showing the emergency stairwell, her hands clasped tightly between her knees. Shortly before 11 o'clock, the image moved. The ground floor door of the stairwell opened, and 4 figures slipped inside one after another, moving close to the wall in a single file formation, their heads covered by hoods, their bodies made square beneath layers of soft armor, and each of them carried a long black object that Sadie had seen often enough on the news to recognize. Guns. The kind that weren't meant for self-defense. Her breath caught in her throat. The four shadows climbed the stairs at a steady pace. The 3rd floor, the 5th floor, the 7th floor, neither rushing nor slowing, and their calmness was more frightening than any display of aggression. Then they stopped outside the steel door separating the stairwell from the 9th floor hallway, a door that could only be opened with a building access card. One of them moved aside, and from beyond the edge of the frame, a 5th figure stepped forward, without a hood or body armor, dressed in a dark uniform so familiar that for 1 second, Sadie thought her eyes were deceiving her. The person raised a hand toward the card reader, a gesture performed thousands of times, practiced and casual, and the small light on the lock changed color. The 9th floor door opened, allowing 4 gun barrels to enter. The person who had swiped the card lifted his face for a single moment. Looking directly into the camera, he probably believed no one was watching that night. And Sadie saw him clearly, the face that nodded to her every morning in the lobby, asked whether her shift had been tiring, and held the elevator door whenever she carried something heavy. Gio, the security manager of the Meridian, the man who controlled the layout of every camera, every blind spot, and every maintenance schedule. And in that instant, every scattered piece from the past several weeks slammed together inside Sadie's mind to form a complete and chilling picture. The camera maintenance scheduled on the night Enzo was stabbed, the cups of coffee slipping between every camera angle like ghosts, the person on the inside Enzo had been quietly searching for. Everything pointed to one man, the man standing below, personally opening the 9th floor door for armed killers coming to take the life of his own employer. The 4 dark figures flooded into the 9th floor hallway, in a formation of 2 in front and 2 behind, their gun barrels sweeping across every doorway, while Sadie sat frozen inside the steel room, afraid even to blink as she watched them advance toward the door of apartment 9A through the silent screen. There was no sound. That was what made everything feel so terrifyingly unreal. She could see it all but hear nothing, as though she were watching a nightmare unfold behind soundproof glass, and in that silence, the beating of her own heart became the only sound in the entire battle. The 2 men in front pressed close to the door of apartment 9A. One dropped to his knees and began working on something around the lock, while the other 2 turned their backs and guarded opposite ends of the hallway. At the exact moment when all 4 gun barrels were pointed in the wrong directions, the door of apartment 9B, the apartment they believed belonged to a nurse who was away working her shift, opened soundlessly behind them. Enzo stepped out from the darkness of her own home. Sadie saw him on the screen, tall and straight, moving with the same absolute stillness she had first witnessed through her peephole on that first day. Except tonight that stillness carried a weapon, and before the 2 guards could sense anything behind them, he opened fire. 2 flashes of light burst across the black and white image, one after the other, brief, precise, without a wasted beat, and the 2 dark figures collapsed onto the carpet almost at the same time, falling before they could even turn around, their guns flying from their hands and sliding across the floor. The remaining 2 reacted with mechanical speed. They rolled away from the door of apartment 9A and rushed diagonally across the hallway toward the marble-covered pillar beside the elevator lobby, then returned fire from behind that shelter. The silent screen turned the gunfight into a strange dance of light. Muzzle flashes bloomed from both ends of the hallway like flowers opening in slow motion. Pieces of wall exploded into clouds of white dust. Fragments of plaster drifted down, and a wall lamp struck by a bullet went dark, leaving another section of the corridor swallowed by shadow. Through it all, Enzo retreated behind the doorway of apartment 9B, using the wall of Sadie's own home as cover, leaning out for brief moments to return fire before drawing back again, steady, cold, and patient, like a craftsman performing the work he knew best. Sadie sat motionless, both hands pressed tightly over her mouth. The nurse's mind inside her automatically counted the bodies lying on the carpet, evaluated the positions in which they had fallen, and noted which of them were still moving. But beneath that mechanical analysis, another wave was rising, one she couldn't stop. The man outside was facing alone, the gun barrels of killers who had been paid to murder him, on a battlefield he could easily have avoided. All he had needed to do was truly leave for Milwaukee that night. All he had needed to do was regard her as a stranger, exactly as the 3-word report had described her. Too clean, too faint, harmless. But he had stayed. He had turned her own apartment into an ambush point. He had built this entire trap, so every blade aimed at her and at him would be forced into the light of the 9th floor hallway. Then, on the screen showing the emergency stairwell, a new movement twisted Sadie's stomach. The 9th floor door opened again, and the man who stepped through wasn't another armed shadow. He wore a dark blue suit without a single wrinkle, his hair polished into absurd perfection amid a hallway clouded with plaster dust. Preston Hale. He entered the battlefield as though he were walking into his own auditorium, and the way he stood apart from everything around him appeared almost unreal. A peacock wandering into a den of wolves, his gleaming leather shoes stepping over spent shell casings, his face twisted by shouts, the silent monitor swallowed completely. His arms swung toward the marble pillar where the 2 black-line men were holding their position, ordering them, urging them forward, demanding, and although no sound reached her, Sadie could read the words on his lips. Bring her out to me. Bring her out. Even now, on the boundary between life and death, the only thought that existed inside that man's mind was the possession of her. Sadie watched him screaming in silence, and the strange thing was that the familiar fear didn't rise inside her, as it always had before. Instead, for the first time, she saw Preston Hale at his true size, not the enormous ghost that had covered 3 years of her life, but only a small man standing in the wrong place, a predator that knew how to hunt only creatures without claws or teeth, now trembling behind the men he had paid with money. Her gaze moved away from him and returned to the screen where Enzo was still holding his position behind the doorway of apartment 9B, his shoulder resting against the wall of her home. A tear rolled down Sadie's cheek without her realizing it, then another, hot and silent. She wasn't crying from fear. She raised one hand and touched the cold surface of the monitor, resting her fingers over the small black and white figure of the man outside, and understood why she was crying. In 27 years of life, through the deaths of her parents, through 3 years of hell, through 1 year of running, not one person had ever stood and fought for her. No one had ever believed her safety was something worth bleeding for. People had either looked away, protected the man hunting her, or advised her to endure. And tonight, the first person to take up a weapon and stand between her and every gun barrel in the world was the man the entire city called a devil. In that moment, inside the steel room flooded with white light, Sadie Monroe pressed her hand to the monitor and cried as she had never been allowed to cry, tears born not from panic, but from something breaking open after years of being frozen. And in the middle of that moment, as though fate wouldn't allow her even 1 complete minute, all 9 screens in front of her went dark at once. Black. No static, no flicker, only absolute darkness covering the entire wall, and the familiar hum of the air purifier stopped for half a second before the room's backup power activated, shifting the white lights into the weaker yellow glow of emergency mode. Sadie sat frozen before the black wall, her hand still pressed against the cold glass where Enzo's figure had been only a second earlier. She had no way of knowing that in the technical basement of the Meridian, Gio, after hearing through the radio that his Blackline team was being destroyed 1 man at a time, had just made the final move of a gambler who had lost everything. He had pulled the main power switch for the entire building, plunging all 19 floors into darkness, cutting off every camera, every electronic lock, and every light, all to seize the only thing that might still save him that night: chaos. Inside the steel room, Sadie knew only one thing. She could no longer see Enzo. She didn't know whether he was still standing or had already fallen, and the black wall of screens before her was silent as a grave. The darkness across the dead screens stretched on like an entire century. Sadie sat motionless beneath the faint yellow light of the backup power, listening to her own breathing and the low mechanical hum of the air purifier, while beyond the steel door, the world had become an expanse of absolute silence that her imagination filled with every horrifying image it could summon. Was he still standing? Had he been shot? Was someone lying on the hallway carpet among the plaster dust and spent shell casings? She counted every second to keep her mind from breaking apart, counting to 60 and then beginning again at 1, over and over, both hands gripping the medical bag on her lap as though it were a life preserver, while Enzo's warning repeated inside her skull like an endless prayer. No matter what you see on the screens, don't open the door. But he hadn't told her what to do when there were no screens left to watch, when this blindness was more torturous than any image could have been. She had almost risen from the chair when the sound came, a beep. Small, thin, electronic, coming from the numerical keypad outside the steel door. and Sadie's heart leaped as hope burst into flame inside her. Enzo. He was alive. He had come back for her. But in the middle of that hope, a freezing shard of memory cut across her thoughts. Enzo's voice that afternoon. Slow and unmistakably clear. Only one person in the world knows this code, and he would have entered it cleanly within seconds, the way a man opened the door to his own home. What was happening outside didn't sound like that. A second beep came, followed by a long, rapid sequence of beeps, as though someone were entering not a code, but an entire series of commands. And then somewhere inside the wall came a sound Sadie had never heard before, the sound of the locking bolts releasing themselves one by one. Click, click, click. They weren't being forced. They were surrendering on their own, as though the fortified steel door had received an order from the deepest internal system of the building itself. Later, after everything was over, Sadie would understand the true strategy behind that moment. As security manager, Gio had studied the floor plans and noticed a subtle discrepancy in the building's load-bearing walls, a hollow space that shouldn't exist on any official blueprint. He brought an encrypted electronic override device, designed to hijack localized access panels. When he pulled the master power switch, the room's system briefly stalled as it shifted to internal backup power. That 3-second reboot window was all Gio needed to connect his device and force the electronic locking bolts to release. But in that moment, Sadie knew nothing about mechanisms or back doors. She only knew to retreat, pressing herself into the farthest corner of the room as the heavy steel door separated from its frame and swung outward. And there, in the open doorway beneath the weak yellow emergency lights of the hallway, stood Gio. His dark uniform was disheveled and covered in plaster dust, one shoulder torn. And on the face that had greeted her with a nod every morning was a smile Sadie would never forget. The smile of a man who had lost everything except one final move. Tense and twisted, his eyes burning with the light of a gambler placing his last coin on the table. "Hello, nurse," he said, his voice hoarse. "Forgive the sudden visit, but you're the only thing in this building that still has value to me tonight." Sadie grabbed the medical bag, hurled it toward him, and lunged to one side, but the room was too narrow and he was too fast. His hand seized her arm and twisted it behind her back with a brutal motion that sent pain shooting through her shoulder and into her skull. And then she felt it. Something thin, cold, and sharp pressed against one side of her throat, light enough not to hurt yet, but clear enough for her to understand exactly what it was. "Let's go," he breathed into her ear. "We're going to greet the boss." He pushed her out of the steel room, through the dark bedroom of apartment 9A, through the living room where the glass wall still glittered with the lights of a Chicago that looked absurdly peaceful far below, and into the 9th floor hallway. Sadie would remember forever the scene that awaited her there. The familiar corridor transformed into a trench where the gunfire had only just stopped, smoke and dust hanging in ribbons beneath the emergency lights, the walls pitted with bullet holes, motionless bodies scattered across the carpet she had walked over every day. And at the far end of the hallway, standing upright amid the thinning smoke, was a tall figure with a weapon still in his hand. Alive. Still alive. Sadie's heart screamed those words, before relief could turn into terror over her own situation. Enzo was alive, almost entirely unharmed, and he stood there watching as Gio pushed her into the hallway with a blade pressed against her throat. "Stay where you are, Barone," Gio shouted, his voice breaking at the end. "Put the gun down, kick it toward me, or I swear I'll do something neither of us wants." Time froze. Sadie looked at Enzo through the smoke, and despite the full length of the hallway between them, she could clearly see those fathomless dark eyes moving quickly as he assessed everything. The position of the blade, the angle of Gio's body behind her, the absence of enough space for any shot that didn't carry an unacceptable risk. And then she saw something she had never seen in this man before. Helplessness. It appeared for only a fraction of a second, a hairline crack across a face carved from granite. But it was real. "Don't," she wanted to scream. "Don't listen to him. If you lower the gun, we'll both die." But the blade pressed more firmly against her throat, killing every sound before it could leave her. And then, slowly, 1 inch at a time, in the absolute silence of the entire hallway, Enzo Barone, the man no one in this city had ever been able to force into anything, lowered his weapon. During the first minutes of the struggle, no one noticed one small detail, not even Gio himself. Throughout those blind hours of waiting inside the steel room, when fear threatened to swallow reason, Sadie's hands had done what they always did whenever their owner needed something to anchor her. They opened the medical bag and checked its contents out of professional habit. Rolls of bandage, gauze, vascular clamps, medicine, and the scalpel with its protective cover still in place. An instrument so familiar that merely touching it slowed her heartbeat by 1 beat. Then, before closing the bag, guided by an instinct she didn't bother to name, she had slipped the scalpel into the pocket of her coat. It was a small, unconscious gesture, like putting your keys into your pocket before leaving home. And now, in the smoke-blinded hallway, with another person's blade pressed beside her throat and the man at the far end slowly lowering his weapon because her life depended on it, the scalpel rested silently inside Sadie's pocket like a second heart. "Put the gun on the floor," Gio shouted. "Kick it toward me." His arm tightened around her shoulders, holding her more firmly, and through every muscle in his body, Sadie sensed a truth that 3 years of living beside fear had taught her to read fluently. He was trembling. A man holding a knife with a shaking hand was more dangerous than one whose hand was steady. The emergency department had taught her that, but it had also taught her something else. That in every crisis there was always one golden moment, brief and unique, when every factor opened a narrow gap, and whoever recognized that gap first would decide everything. Sadie watched Enzo bend down and place the gun on the hallway floor so slowly that every centimeter felt like torture. His eyes never left her, and she understood that he was buying time, waiting, gambling on something that hadn't yet taken shape. Their eyes met through the smoke for a fraction of a second, and within that fraction of a second, Sadie made the decision of her life. The fingers of her right hand, which had been hanging loosely at her side, quietly slipped into the pocket of her coat. They found the scalpel immediately, as naturally as finding the pulse in a patient's wrist. Her thumb pushed off the protective cover without a sound, and inside Sadie's mind, every trace of panic suddenly receded like the tide, revealing the smooth bedrock she stood upon every night in the emergency department. The place where trembling had no place, where there was only anatomy. Gio's arm was wrapped across her shoulders, his wrist angled just in front of her chest, the inner side facing upward, and beneath the skin there, less than a few millimeters deep, lay the tendons controlling the fingers that held the blade against her throat. Structures Sadie had memorized during her first year of nursing school, structures she had bandaged and helped repair dozens of times. She didn't need to look. Her hand knew the way. Sadie released one very slow breath and allowed her entire body to relax, as though she were surrendering. She felt Gio's arm loosen by exactly 1 centimeter because he believed his captive had given in, and within that same fraction of a second, she drew the scalpel and cut. One stroke, brief, shallow enough, absolutely precise, across the inner side of his wrist, exactly where she intended. Not 1 millimeter more and not one less, a cut that any surgeon who saw it would have nodded at, made not to destroy, but to switch something off, the way one turned off a switch. The effect was immediate. Gio's fingers opened against his will. The knife left Sadie's throat and fell onto the carpet, and a sound escaped him that was half shock and half pain as his own hand betrayed him, followed by his knee and then the rest of his body. 3 seconds, only 3 seconds passed between the cut and the moment the hostage-taker collapsed onto the carpet, clutching his wrist. But 3 seconds were an entire century to the man at the far end of the hallway. Enzo exploded from stillness like a released bowstring. The gun was back in his hand before Gio's knee touched the floor, and his tall body crossed the smoke-filled hallway so quickly that Sadie saw only a streak of shadow. By the time she blinked, everything was over. Gio lay face down on the carpet beneath Enzo's firmly planted knee, completely disarmed and securely restrained. The most powerful security access card in the building had been torn from his neck, while at the other end of the hallway, the stairwell door burst open and Rocco charged in with his men, spreading out to seal every escape route. Surrounded on all sides, Preston Hale, who had been slowly dragging himself toward the stairs with a bloodless face, stopped like an animal caught in a trap, with no opening left anywhere around him. The noise of the battle died completely, leaving only the faint buzzing of the emergency lights and the breathing of those still standing. Sadie stood in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by smoke, dust, and weak yellow light, the scalpel still in her right hand, and the moment the final danger was secured, the smooth bedrock inside her shattered. The trembling returned like a broken dam. The hand holding the scalpel shook so violently that she had to use her other hand to pry each finger from the handle. Her legs weakened beneath her, and tears poured out beyond her control. She sobbed in the middle of the ruined hallway, weeping with her entire chest, Because she wasn't a warrior, and had never been one. She was a nurse trained to stitch human beings back together, not cut them open. She was still a person capable of feeling fear down to the marrow of her bones, but through the curtain of tears and trembling, a new truth remained standing like a marker newly driven into the ground of her life. Tonight, for the first time, she was no longer the prey. She heard footsteps approaching, calm and familiar. Then warmth settled over both her shoulders. Enzo's coat, still carrying the scent of smoke and cedarwood, wrapped around her trembling body like a blanket. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't say everything was all right. He didn't say any of the things people usually said. He simply stood beside her, close enough to hold the edge of the coat against her shoulders so it wouldn't slip, and Sadie rested her forehead against his shoulder and cried out the last of her tears. No words were needed. When the trembling had eased enough for her legs to hold her upright again, Sadie lifted her head from Enzo's shoulder, and her gaze traveled toward the far end of the hallway, where Preston Hale was kneeling inside a circle of silent men. His dark blue suit, once without a single wrinkle, was now crumpled and coated in plaster dust. His carefully styled hair had fallen loose in damp strands across his sweat-soaked forehead, and the face that had once appeared on the covers of medical journals was now bloodless beneath the emergency lights. A face Sadie was seeing clearly for the first time in her life, stripped of power, stripped of glory, nothing more than a man on his knees. She stepped away from Enzo's embrace, and he didn't hold her back. With his coat still resting around her shoulders, Sadie walked slowly through the ruined hallway, past smoke, dust, and broken pieces of plaster, until she stood exactly 3 steps from the man who had hunted her through all those long years, the same distance he had once used to overpower her. But tonight it was a distance she had chosen for herself. Preston looked up at her, and like a machine programmed for too long to change, he immediately began his final speech, his once smooth voice now breaking apart. Sadie, you have to tell them this is all a misunderstanding. I came here because of you. Everything I've ever done has been for you. He swallowed, his eyes darting rapidly between her and the silent gun barrels around him. Then his voice changed, softening, sweetening again, returning to the tone of those locked rooms from long ago. You know you need me. No one else could ever tolerate you, Sadie. You're difficult. You're sensitive. You're broken. I'm the only one patient enough to gather every piece of you. I'm the only person in this world who loves you exactly as you are. The hallway was utterly silent. Sadie stood watching him, and she realized that something miraculous was happening inside her. Those words, the words that had once been chains, the words that had once convinced her she truly was difficult, truly was broken, truly was unworthy of anyone else, now fell upon her and slid away like rainwater over stone, leaving behind nothing but disgust mixed with pity. Not pity for him, but for the young woman she had once been, the woman who had believed him. She didn't slap him, though her hand had imagined that slap thousands of times during sleepless nights. She didn't scream all the pain she had carried into his face, though her throat had rehearsed every word throughout all those months of running. She simply stood straight, adjusted the coat around her shoulders, looked directly into the eyes that had once been the center of every fear in her life, and spoke in a voice so calm that even she was surprised by it. You don't have any power over me anymore. That was all. Not another word. And Sadie watched that sentence enter Preston more deeply than any blade, because for a man who lived through control, there was no sentence heavier than being declared meaningless. His face collapsed layer by layer, first disbelief, then panic, then emptiness. The emptiness of a man who had just lost the only thing that defined him. Enzo stepped beside her. He said nothing, and only looked at her, and in those fathomless dark eyes was a question as clear as if he had spoken it aloud. What do you want? All she had to do was nod, and his world had 1,000 ways to make this man disappear from the earth without leaving a trace. Sadie understood the question, and understood the weight of being given the choice. For the first time in her relationship with Preston Hale, she held the power over life and death, and she shook her head. I don't want blood, she said, loudly enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. I want justice. He used that clean, shining system to crush me, so he must be crushed by that same system, publicly, beneath the lights, in front of everyone who ever applauded him. A silence followed. Then Enzo gave one slow nod, and Sadie saw in his eyes not the disappointment of a man whose familiar solution had been refused, but something close to respect. In the days that followed, justice moved exactly as she had asked. Every file Enzo's people had quietly gathered over the previous weeks. Evidence that the medication error used to frame Sadie had been deliberately created, complete with traces of alterations inside the electronic records. Recorded statements from 2 other nurses who had silently abandoned their careers because of Preston. Research data that had been manipulated in the studies published under his name. All of it was sent anonymously. At the same time, on the same morning, to the state medical board, to the ethics committees of every hospital involved, and to the inboxes of 3 major newspapers. The empire of prestige Preston Hale had spent 20 years building collapsed in less than 2 weeks. His medical license was urgently suspended, and then revoked. Prosecutors opened a criminal case. Former victims, given courage by the first person who had stepped forward, emerged one after another into the light with stories of their own, and the face that had once appeared on the covers of medical journals now appeared on front pages in an entirely different way. As for the night of the intrusion at the Meridian, not a single word escaped into the outside world. There was no written agreement, no signature, no clause. Enzo's world didn't operate through documents. There was only one brief moment before Preston and the surviving members of Blackline were taken out of the building, when Enzo stepped in front of each of them and looked directly into their eyes. He didn't threaten them or raise his voice. He only looked, and within that gaze lay every term of an unspoken contract. You are leaving here alive tonight, and the price of that life is permanent silence. Speak once, whether to the police, in court, or while drunk, and no system in this world will be able to protect you. They understood. Men like them always understood that language faster than anything written on paper. As for Gio, when Rocco hauled him upright from the floor with his injured wrist temporarily bandaged, the traitor didn't beg. Perhaps he understood better than anyone the laws of the world he had betrayed. He only lowered his head and walked between 2 silent men, through the stairwell door, and disappeared from this story. His fate belonged to another court, inside another darkness, where no one ever returned to tell what happened. Sadie kept only one final image for herself, as the ending to 3 years of hell. It was the morning she stood before the television in the department break room, surrounded by murmuring coworkers, watching Preston Hale being led out of his attorney's office building in Philadelphia, his head bowed before a forest of cameras, his hands locked behind his back inside a shining pair of figure-8 handcuffs. The restraints of the very legal system and world of prestige that had once opened their arms to protect him were now closing around his wrists, publicly, beneath the lights, before the eyes of everyone. Several weeks later, the 9th floor hallway of the Meridian had taken on an entirely new appearance. The cream-colored carpet had been replaced with one that was spotless and new. The walls, once riddled with damage, were now smooth, beneath a fresh coat of paint that still carried the scent of newness, and the row of wall lamps cast a warm golden glow. If a stranger stepped out of the elevator, they would never have guessed that this place had once been a battlefield. That evening, Sadie returned from a long shift, stepped out of the elevator with tired shoulders and a light heart, walked along the familiar hallway, stopped in front of the door to apartment 9B, slipped her key into the lock, and at the exact moment the key turned smoothly through a full rotation, she suddenly stopped, realizing something that left her standing motionless in the corridor. She had walked straight from the elevator to her own door. She hadn't paused to listen. She hadn't glanced toward either end of the hallway. And throughout that entire evening, all of the day before, and the whole week that had just passed, she hadn't looked through the peephole even once. The habit that had seeped into her flesh and blood over so many long years. The ritual of examining the world through a warped piece of glass before daring to step outside or come back in had quietly left her without her noticing, like a wound covered in new skin that a person only realizes has healed when they accidentally touch it and discover that it no longer hurts. Sadie stood there with one hand still resting on the doorknob, and a slow smile spread across her lips, the smile of someone who had just understood that freedom didn't arrive with trumpets or celebration. It came silently, like this, on an ordinary evening, before an ordinary door, when fear had finally stopped serving as the gatekeeper of her life. A door opened softly behind her, and Sadie turned around. Enzo stood in the doorway of apartment 9A, still carrying that same straight and quiet posture, but in his hands were 2 steaming cups of coffee, and inside those fathomless dark eyes that had once never rested on anyone for longer than a second was something entirely different now, a gentle expectation he no longer bothered to hide. "This time, it's from me," he said, one corner of his mouth lifting into the closest thing to a smile that this man knew how to make. "I brewed it in my own kitchen, with my own hands. You can verify the source." Sadie laughed, the sound clear and light as it traveled through the newly painted hallway. She accepted the warm cup of coffee from his hand, and the two of them simply stood beside each other in comfortable silence, neither feeling any need to fill it with words. Then Enzo placed his own coffee on the small table beside the door, reached into his pocket, withdrew a piece of paper folded into quarters, and handed it to her. Sadie opened it. Written across the page in straight, decisive handwriting was a series of numbers, and she recognized what they were even before he explained. It was the new access code to the steel room behind the wardrobe. The room that had saved her life. The room whose old code had once been the secret of only one man. "I replaced the entire system," Enzo said, his voice growing lower, "and this time, only you and I know the code." That was all. No flowers, no candles, no tender declarations. Yet Sadie understood completely what the man had just given her, because for someone who had spent his entire life behind layers of walls, layers of companies, and layers of silence, sharing the final door protecting him with another person was the greatest declaration of love he knew how to make. She folded the paper, slipped it into the left breast pocket of her clothing, then raised her eyes to him. "I accept," she said softly, and those two simple words softened the sharp face of the most powerful man in Chicago in a way no one in his world had ever been allowed to witness. That night, they stood beside each other before the glass wall of apartment 9, a warm cups of coffee in their hands, looking down at Chicago as it stretched beneath the early winter sky like an endless river of light. And Sadie thought about the journey that had brought her there, about the young woman who had once fled into the night carrying only one bag, who had rented this apartment with one single wish: to disappear from the world, to become invisible, to remain unseen by everyone. Yet fate, with its arrangement both ironic and merciful, had led her to this exact place so she could receive the opposite, because it was here, behind the door of apartment 9B, that for the first time in so many years, someone had truly seen her, not as the harmless shadow described in a report, not as prey in the eyes of a hunter, but as herself, Sadie Monroe, with all her wounds, her courage, and her worth. Sadie's story ends there, but it leaves us with lessons worth carrying forward. That silence is the most fertile ground in which evil is allowed to grow. That every time wrongdoing is concealed or overlooked, it sends another root deeper into the earth, and only when people dare to speak, dare to bring the truth into the light, can evil truly be cut down. That the safest place in this world isn't found behind 4 strong walls or thick locks, but beside someone who sees our true worth and cherishes it, and that the greatest courage a person can possess sometimes doesn't lie in running far away or seeking the most painful revenge, but in the moment we stand upright, look directly into the eyes of our fear, and reclaim our own life. If Sadie's journey touched your heart, please press like and share this video with the people you love who also cherish meaningful stories. Please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the thrilling and moving stories we bring to you every day. And please leave a comment telling us which moment in Sadie's journey moved you the most and how this story made you feel. We sincerely hope to hear the thoughts that come from the deepest places in your hearts, because every comment you leave is the greatest encouragement for us to continue telling even better stories. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. We wish every one of you watching this video lasting good health and a life filled with joy, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.